I used to think therapy was a place where secrets were safe, a sanctuary where, for $1,200, 0 cents a month, I could let my guard down. No corporate politics, no press releases, no curated image, just me, my unraveling thoughts, and Dr. Madison Rains. Licensed therapist, softly spoken, expensive, and seemingly made for people like me. I was 34, living in San Francisco, working as a PR director for one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the city. On paper, I had it together. High salary, downtown apartment, good skincare. But inside, I was crumbling, still dragging around the emotional debris of a brutal divorce, work-induced panic attacks, and this constant fear that I was one misstep away from losing everything I'd built. Therapy was my life raft. Madison was, or so I thought, the only person I could talk to without a filter. At first, it helped. I began to sleep more than 3 hours a night. I stopped crying in the office bathroom between investor calls. I started journaling. Madison's office was minimalist, calm, beige and blue tones. She always offered tea, never judged. Over the course of 8 months, I told her everything. About how my ex-husband cheated on me with someone 10 years younger. About how I once fainted in the lobby of our building from a panic attack, then lied and said it was low blood sugar. About the way my mother's voice still echoes in my head whenever I do anything imperfect. I even confessed the darkest thing I'd never said aloud. That sometimes I felt like I had built my entire life just to keep other people from seeing how hollow I really was. Madison never flinched. She nodded, asked questions, scribbled in her notebook with her perfect posture and calm energy. I left each session lighter, trusting her more, trusting the process. Then, one Monday, everything shifted. I was standing in the kitchenette at work, waiting for the espresso machine to finish screaming, when Jessica, the new organizational consultant our company had recently brought in, walked in. She was blonde, polished, around 30, and too smooth. Her presence always unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. She smiled as she poured herself a black coffee and said casually, "I read somewhere that children of narcissistic mothers often overcompensate in their careers. Makes sense though, right? The need to control perception, to perfect everything, to prove you're not broken." It wasn't what she said, it was the way she said it. I froze. Those weren't just words. That was the exact phrasing I had used during a session with Madison 2 weeks prior. Word for word. I smiled politely and made a quick excuse to leave, heart racing, nausea blooming in my throat. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe she read it in the same psychology blog I did. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe. But I couldn't let it go. And when I got back to my desk and Googled Jessica, that's when my stomach really dropped. Jessica Rains, the same last name. A few more clicks and I found her LinkedIn. Executive coach, founder of Rains Consulting, BA in behavioral psychology, and then, like a knife to the gut, one podcast appearance where she casually mentioned, "My mom's been a therapist for 20 years, so I basically grew up absorbing that world." My therapist, Dr. Madison Rains. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, the phrasing, the timing, the uncanny precision with which Jessica seemed to poke at my wounds. I wanted to believe it was all a coincidence, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. I'd told Madison things I had never even told my best friend. I'd cried in her office, confessed weakness. Now those same vulnerabilities were being whispered back to me in my own workplace, under fluorescent lights and behind smiles. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. But I knew one thing: someone I trusted had opened the door, and now the wolves were inside. I didn't go back to therapy that week. I told Madison I had a scheduling conflict and needed to reschedule, and she replied with her usual professionalism, "Of course, just let me know what works for you." That calm, pleasant tone now felt sinister. My world had tilted, and I needed to understand whether I was spinning from paranoia or if I had just glimpsed the edge of a deeper betrayal. I couldn't shake what Jessica had said in the kitchenette. It wasn't just the phrasing, it was the calculated way she'd used it, not as a casual observation, but like someone dropping a subtle weapon in conversation just to see where it landed. And the more I thought about it, the more little moments from recent weeks started coming back to me. The way Jessica always seemed to anticipate what would trigger me in meetings. How she would strategically position herself near leadership when discussing team morale. How she would glance at me during internal reviews as if she already knew where the cracks were. I began to observe her more closely at work. She was careful, always measured, but she'd built an oddly fast rapport with our CEO, Noah, and the head of HR, Lindsay. I noticed they were all suddenly aligned on restructuring the communications division, my division. Jessica started sitting in on calls I normally led. My name began disappearing from planning documents. I wasn't being pushed out openly, but I could feel the walls tightening. And Jessica? She never said anything direct, but her presence had become a constant hum of pressure just behind my shoulder. I started doing my own digging. I looked up Rains Consulting, small firm founded by Jessica 3 years ago. No mention of her mother on the official site, but I found a podcast interview where she spoke glowingly about growing up watching my mother help people transform. I searched deeper, checking professional therapist registries. There she was, Dr. Madison Rains, practicing for over 20 years in San Francisco. Same credentials, same office, everything lined up. I even found a Yelp review for her practice from someone who described her as warm, intuitive, and a wonderful guide through trauma. I wanted to throw up. My heart didn't want to believe it, but my gut already knew. Somehow Madison had shared information from our sessions, maybe intentionally, maybe just through idle conversation, but it had made its way to her daughter, and Jessica had used it to tear into my career from the inside. I needed to be absolutely sure. So I started laying my own trap. I booked another therapy session. This time, I was ready. I prepared a few specific confessions, things that sounded real but weren't. I wanted to see if the leak was active or if Jessica had just gotten lucky once. So I told Madison that I'd recently had a panic attack in the women's restroom after a team meeting, that I'd been considering stepping down from my role due to burnout, and most importantly, that I feared someone on my team was deliberately trying to sabotage me, but I didn't know who. She responded as always, empathetic, gentle, validating. But I was watching her closely. And when she said, "It's good to name that fear. Sometimes naming it helps strip its power," I almost laughed. Naming it was the whole point. 3 days later, Jessica approached me after a company town hall. Her tone was light, too casual, as she said, "Hey, if you ever need support with the new restructuring stuff, just say the word. I know this transition has been stressful for everyone, and I totally get how sometimes it all feels too much. I've seen people literally break down in the bathroom. We're all human, right?" That was it. There it was, verbatim. It hit me like a freight train. This wasn't coincidence. This was theft of privacy, of trust, of my safety. I barely held it together, nodding with a polite smile while my palms clenched into fists behind my back. The air in the office felt poisonous now, like every corner had eyes and every smile hid a knife. And the worst part, I couldn't talk to anyone. HR was already cozy with Jessica. Leadership loved her. I couldn't walk in there and accuse her without sounding unstable, especially when the rumors about my mental health struggles were already circulating. I'd be proving their point. I started recording, not the therapy sessions, not yet, but conversations with Jessica at work. I began documenting everything. Every time she referenced something she couldn't have known unless she'd heard it from Madison, I wrote it down. I kept emails, Slack messages, notes from meetings. I created a private folder on my home computer and backed it up in the cloud under a fake file name. I even started journaling again, not for healing this time, but for evidence. And then another blow. I was pulled into a performance improvement plan meeting. Lindsay from HR and Jessica were both present. They framed it gently, support, help, alignment, but I knew exactly what it was. A forced path toward resignation. My options were clear: step down quietly or ride out a paper trail toward termination. I played along. I thanked them for the feedback, promised to refrec, and asked for a week to regroup. But inside, I was seething. I left the office that afternoon and didn't go home. I sat in my car outside Madison's office, watching patients come and go. I stared at the small brass plaque with her name on it and felt something harden inside me. She had sat there, nodding like she cared, while her daughter used my soul as strategy. And she was still charging me for it. I opened my phone and started recording a voice memo. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew this. They thought I was fragile. They thought I would shatter. They thought I would break like some glass doll they could mold and discard. But I had spent my entire adult life surviving first a narcissistic mother, then a lying husband, And now this. I wasn't gonna break. I was going to burn. Didn't show up to work the next day. I didn't even bother sending a message. I knew that by then, Jessica and HR were probably crafting some narrative about my emotional instability or difficulty handling feedback, and frankly, I didn't care. Let them think I was spiraling. The more fragile they believed I was, the less they would see me coming. Instead, I spent the day doing exactly what I needed to, preparing for war. I dug through every email, every calendar invite, every digital footprint Jessica had left. I mapped out how quickly she'd inserted herself into the company's leadership structure. I built a timeline of key conversations and meetings I'd had with Madison that somehow echoed later in the office through Jessica's words and actions. I pulled credit card receipts, showing 8 months of therapy bills, $1,200, 0 cents every month paid like clockwork, with my entire soul offered in return. I called a friend of mine, Sophia, who worked in legal compliance for a different tech company. We hadn't spoken in a while, but we'd always had mutual respect. I kept the conversation vague at first, then slowly layered in the details. Unethical sharing of confidential information, a family relationship between a licensed therapist and a corporate consultant, career sabotage, and the possibility of multiple violations of HIPAA and professional ethics standards. Sophia listened quietly. Then she asked, "Do you have any proof it was shared deliberately?" I hesitated. "Not yet. But I can get it." Her voice sharpened. "If you're right, this isn't just unethical, it's illegal. But you'll need something real, tangible, otherwise it's just your word against theirs and they'll crush you with it." That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing Jessica's smirk, the way she'd positioned herself beside my CEO, how comfortable she was in meetings where she didn't belong. I kept hearing Madison's calm voice, telling me, "You're safe here," even as she sold me out. I needed a plan, and I needed to catch them off guard. So I booked one final therapy session with Madison, just like nothing had happened. When I walked into her office, I felt like I was seeing the room for the first time. Not as a space of healing, but as a perfectly curated set for betrayal. I sat down, smiled politely, and pressed record on my phone while it sat screened down in my purse. "Thanks for squeezing me in," I said. "I've been feeling really anxious. I don't know if it's work or just me." Madison nodded with that familiar therapist posture, pen poise, eyes soft. "You've been under a lot of pressure, your role is so high stakes, and you've mentioned before how much you tie your self-worth to professional success. Do you feel like that's shifting?" It was subtle, but my stomach clenched. I had never used that phrasing. I had said something similar, but not like that. That line had come from Jessica in a one-on-one development session where she'd smiled while dismantling me with faux concern. That moment confirmed it. Madison and Jessica were either talking directly about me or Jessica had access to my therapy notes. Either way, it was a gross violation, so I leaned in. "I've actually been thinking of taking a leave of absence. I don't know if I'm cut out for this industry anymore," I said, watching her eyes. I keep replaying that panic attack in the executive restroom. That moment really broke something in me. Madison's gaze stayed steady. "Acknowledging the wound is the first step to healing it," she said softly. "You're not broken. You're exhausted." Again, familiar, too familiar. After the session, I walked out calmly, my hands shaking inside my coat pockets. That night, I uploaded the recording to a secure drive and typed up a transcript. Then I pulled every relevant policy from the California Board of Behavioral Sciences, the American Psychological Association, and HIPAA regulations. If even a single line from that recording showed Madison had disclosed client information or used it to benefit someone else's professional agenda, it would be enough to trigger a licensing review. The transcript alone was enough to raise questions, especially once I cross-referenced Jessica's quotes at work and attached time-stamped emails proving the sequence. The next day, I made an appointment with a lawyer, a real one this time, not just a friend. Her name was Camille, and she specialized in ethics violations and corporate retaliation. I laid out everything: documents, recordings, printed Slack messages, internal emails, the full scope. Camille read through it all without a word, then finally looked up. "This is explosive," she said. "You realize that if this goes public, it won't just take down your therapist. It could implode your former company. Jessica's firm could face lawsuits. The licensing board will absolutely open a case." I nodded. "Good," I said. I'm not here to warn them. I'm here to end them. That same afternoon, Camille filed a formal complaint against Madison Rains with the state licensing board. We also drafted a cease and desist letter to Rains Consulting demanding they preserve all communications involving my name, any references to my case, and any records tied to my employment or mental health. I didn't send it to them yet. I wanted them to feel comfortable a little longer. Let them keep talking. Let them incriminate themselves further. Meanwhile, Camille also filed a civil claim for professional misconduct and emotional damages, $250,000, 0 cents in damages to be exact. The figure wasn't random. It was calculated, $1.20 a month for 8 months of therapy, plus lost income from my forced resignation, plus punitive damages. If they wanted to use my pain for profit, they were going to learn exactly how much it cost. Later that week, I got an email from HR asking for a follow-up on my leave status. I replied politely that I would not be returning and that further communication should go through my attorney. I didn't include any more detail. Let them sit in it. Let the silence do what words couldn't. That evening, while sipping tea in my apartment, I got a notification from Camille. Licensing board confirmed receipt. Formal investigation opened. Timeline 30-60 days. I stared at that message, heart pounding, chest burning, with a quiet, building satisfaction. They had turned my private pain into a corporate weapon. Now I was going to use their arrogance to destroy everything they'd built. The day the article dropped, I was at a coffee shop 2 blocks from Madison's office. I hadn't planned to be there. Something about proximity made me feel grounded, like I could breathe through the rage if I was near the place where it started. I was sipping burnt coffee and trying to ignore the dull buzz in my temples when the notification came in from Silicon Current. Therapist under fire after client confidentiality breach tied to corporate sabotage. I stared at the headline, then clicked. The piece was masterfully written. No names, but unmistakable to anyone who knew the players. A high-level tech executive had allegedly had her private therapy disclosures weaponized against her by a corporate consultant who happened to be the therapist's daughter. A whistleblower complaint had been filed. An investigation by the California Board of Behavioral Sciences was now active. Multiple sources close to the situation, anonymous of course, had confirmed the consultant's suspicious access to private information which had aligned too neatly with decisions made within the executive's workplace. The tone of the article was factual, but the subtext was damning. They'd named Rains Consulting. They didn't need to name Madison. The connection was already out there. By noon, the article had been reposted to several tech blogs, Reddit threads, and even a small but aggressive watchdog site dedicated to mental health ethics. And while I didn't say a word online, I was watching. The story snowballed fast. Comments flooded in. How is this legal? If this happened to me, I'd lose my mind. Therapy is the last place you should have to guard yourself. People were angry. People were scared, and under that fear was a deep simmering recognition. No one is safe when professionals play God with your secrets. Jessica didn't respond publicly. Her firm went quiet on social media, and within hours, the corporate site for Rains Consulting was switched to maintenance mode. But the most satisfying moment came later that evening when someone on LinkedIn posted a screenshot from an internal Slack message that had been accidentally leaked. It showed a frantic string of messages between HR and a partner at Jessica's firm, referencing legal exposure, need to lock down documentation, and ongoing investigation from state board, do not discuss externally. That night, I got an encrypted email from a woman named Lauren. She'd read the article and recognized the story. She said she had also been a patient of Madison's years ago, and that her confidential disclosures had made their way into her startup's investor meetings. A private struggle with anxiety, which she had only ever discussed in therapy, had been brought up by a board member as concerns about her mental fitness. Her company had folded. Her therapist, Madison. She had never connected the dots until now. She wanted to help. I connected her with Camille. And just like that, we weren't just building a complaint, we were building a pattern. A documented trail of a therapist who had a habit of feeding information to the corporate world through her daughter. A week later, Camille received confirmation that Madison had been notified of the investigation. We knew the clock had started. Formal inquiries would begin. Interviews would be scheduled. She would have to turn over her client files, her notes. And if those notes matched what Jessica had used at my company, or if any link between them was uncovered, her license would be in danger. But I wasn't finished. Because while Madison's world was starting to collapse, Jessica was still hiding behind plausible deniability. She had said nothing, denied nothing. She was hoping it would all just blow over. So I decided it was time to push the next domino. I reached out to Silicon Current again and gave them permission to use my name. It wasn't easy. I thought about it for days, weighing every risk. Going public meant sacrificing my anonymity. It meant owning the story, not just as the victim, but as the person willing to burn the entire machine to the ground. But in the end, I realized something simple. They had already taken everything from me. My job, my privacy, my mental health. What else could they take? So I wrote a statement, a direct one. I described what had happened, how therapy had become surveillance, how I had been disarmed by someone trained to disarm me, and how my personal trauma had been turned into a script, handed to a corporate predator in heels. The updated article dropped 2 days later with my name at the top. Former tech exec speaks out, my therapist used my trauma to feed her daughter's career. It was a firestorm. My inbox exploded. Some people were horrified, some shared similar stories. A few trolls said I was exaggerating, looking for attention, that it was all a vendetta. But most people saw the truth for what it was, a system that failed and a woman who refused to let it slide. That same day, a local TV station reached out to do a segment. I declined. I didn't want to become a media figure. I just wanted accountability. I just wanted them to suffer the same public scrutiny I'd been buried under for months, and slowly it started to happen. Jessica's clients began pulling out. Her firm's partnerships were suspended, pending review. A colleague of mine from the tech world forwarded me an internal memo from a major VC firm stating that Rains Consulting had been removed from their preferred vendor list due to reputational concerns. The house of cards was swaying. Madison went quiet, no new posts, no response to press inquiries. Then one day, a Redditor posted a screen grab of her profile being marked under disciplinary review on the state's therapist registry site. It was happening. And I wasn't done yet. Camille advised me that the civil suit could move forward once the board's preliminary investigation wrapped. But the media pressure alone was already taking effect. Jessica tried to reach out through a third-party mutual contact, asking if I'd consider resolving things privately. I didn't respond. Then her lawyer sent Camille a letter warning that continued media statements could result in a countersuit for defamation. Camille laughed when she read it. Let them try. Discovery works both ways. If they sue, we subpoena every file, every email, every note your therapist ever wrote. They didn't follow up. The most surreal moment came one morning as I walked into my apartment building and saw a woman standing in the lobby holding a manila envelope. She looked nervous. Early 40s, professional but exhausted. Are you her? She asked. The woman from the article? I nodded. She handed me the envelope and said, I saw what you did, thank you. You're not alone. Then she turned and walked away. Inside were copies of emails she had exchanged with Madison 5 years ago. Emails referencing client information, scheduling overlap with Jessica's coaching sessions, even a brief line where Madison had said she would talk to Jessica about how to approach a client's leadership anxieties in a corporate context. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was more smoke. And where there's smoke, there's fire. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I wasn't healed. I still had days where I questioned my sanity, where I second-guessed everything. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was losing. I felt like I was winning, slowly, methodically, the way survivors do, not in one glorious cinematic moment, but in pieces, clawing back one truth at a time. And I knew the most satisfying part hadn't even happened yet, because they still thought they could outmaneuver me. They still thought their silence would protect them. But I was done being silent. I was coming for everything they'd built. Not because I needed revenge to feel whole again, but because the only thing more powerful than being hurt was being the one who made sure it never happened again. Camille called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice low but steady. They've responded, she said. The licensing board interviewed Madison. The preliminary report confirms that there's probable cause for disciplinary action. They're moving forward. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. The words hung in the air like a pressure valve finally releasing. Probable cause, not just suspicion. Not just whispered gossip and innuendo, but legal language, institutional judgment. It meant someone else, someone official, looked at the same pile of evidence, and came to the same conclusion I had months ago, that my therapist had betrayed me. And now the system she had hid behind was about to turn on her. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the part that really mattered. Because public humiliation and the slow burn of reputation loss were satisfying, yes, but they were also reactive. I wanted to go further. I wanted consequences with teeth. I wanted Jessica and Madison to feel something they weren't prepared for. Exposure without escape. We filed a formal civil lawsuit that same week. The documents went out to both of them, one to Madison for malpractice and breach of confidentiality, and one to Jessica for knowingly benefiting from improperly obtained information. We asked for $250,000, 0 cents in damages. Therapy costs, lost wages, emotional distress, reputational harm. It wasn't about the money, it was about precision. They needed to see a number that matched what they'd tried to quietly destroy. The initial response from Jessica's lawyer came fast. Denial, as expected. They claimed she had no knowledge of any improper disclosures and acted solely on her own expertise and independent observations. Camille smirked when she read it. If she thinks that line is going to hold in court, she's more arrogant than I thought. Madison's lawyer, on the other hand, was more cautious. He acknowledged the investigation, noted that they were cooperating fully, and asked if we'd be willing to resolve the matter through private mediation. They're scared, Camille said. They know discovery is coming, and that's what's going to wreck them. You don't want to go to trial when your credibility is already cracking. Still, we didn't back off. Camille declined mediation and reiterated our demand for full damages and a formal written admission of fault. We knew they wouldn't agree to that, but we also knew what would happen next. Subpoenas. Madison would have to hand over all her notes, all her session summaries, all the metadata from the scheduling software they used, Jessica's emails, text messages, everything. And if even one piece of documentation showed a breach, one email where Madison wrote something like, "I spoke with a client about X, and it could be helpful for Jessica to know," it would be over. The board would suspend her license. Jessica's firm would implode. Their careers, their reputations, their silence, all of it would disintegrate in public view. The media didn't go away either. After I went public, a local investigative podcast reached out. They specialized in ethics scandals and systemic abuse, and they wanted to do a multi-episode arc. I hesitated at first. I wasn't sure I wanted to narrate my own trauma again and again. But the producer, a woman named Danny, told me something that stuck with me. Stories like this only stop repeating when people realize how often they happen. You're not the first, you won't be the last, but you can be the one who makes it harder for the next person to get away with it. So I agreed. Recording the episodes was like walking through fire in reverse. Every session I'd had with Madison, every manipulation Jessica had played at work, every email that quietly chipped away at my authority, I laid it all out. We went deep into the ethics of therapy, the blurred lines of corporate consulting, the way vulnerability gets twisted when power is involved. The response when the podcast aired was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of emails poured in. Women, men, employees, patients, therapists, all telling stories that echoed mine in terrifying, familiar ways, and the tide began to turn. That week, I learned from a contact at my old company, someone who had stayed friendly despite everything, that Jessica had been asked to step back from her consulting role. The leadership team was reassessing external relationships and had put her on indefinite hold. There had been too many questions. Investors had started to raise eyebrows. The podcast had hit harder than anyone expected, especially in the tech space. And then, the final push. Silicon Current published an internal leak from Rains Consulting. It was an email from Jessica herself, sent months earlier, referencing insight into executive behavior through maternal mentorship. Not proof, not direct, but close enough. The implication was clear. And in a world where trust is currency, that implication was poison. Camille got the call 2 days later. Their lawyers were ready to settle, not just talk, settle. They wanted confidentiality, of course, a non-disclosure agreement, a full release of liability. They offered $150,000, 0 cents, and no admission of fault. Camille didn't even finish reading the email before saying absolutely not. She countered. Full damages, public apology, revocation of Madison's license, formal withdrawal of Jessica's firm from all current contracts where her name was tied to any leadership recommendations based on mental health or behavioral assessments. The amount? Still $250.00. Final. They blanked. The next morning we got their agreement. All of it, every term we demanded. Camille had warned me that settlements are never satisfying, that no amount of paperwork would feel like justice, but she was wrong. The moment I saw Madison's signature on the document, the neat, clean strokes of a woman who had sat across from me, pretending to care while selling me off to her daughter, I felt something break inside me and then reassemble. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough to know I had won. I donated $20,000.00 to an ethics advocacy group for mental health oversight. I used the rest to take time off to build something of my own, to hire a real therapist, one who didn't know my name before I walked through the door, one who listened with curiosity, not strategy, one who asked how I felt, not how I could be repurposed. And as for Jessica, her firm dissolved 2 weeks after the settlement. Clients walked, partners vanished. Madison's license was officially revoked by the state board, effective immediately, citing multiple counts of ethical misconduct and breach of confidentiality. There was no press conference, no apology, just silence. But I didn't need their words. I had the truth. And the next time someone sits across from a therapist and wonders if they're really safe, they might remember my story. They might ask harder questions. They might protect themselves a little earlier. That's the real revenge. Not the money, not the press, but the legacy of refusing to stay quiet, of tearing off the mask and letting the world see what hides behind a gentle smile and a soft voice when it's weaponized. They thought they could bury me with my own pain. Instead, I built a platform out of it, and then I made sure they had nowhere left to stand. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I woke up with a strange sensation. Not relief, not joy, but a deep, vibrating stillness. It was as if my body hadn't caught up to the reality yet, like I was waiting for the next blow that wasn't coming. For months, my nervous system had been braced for attack, waiting for Madison to gaslight me, waiting for Jessica to twist the knife at work, waiting for my own voice to tremble when I tried to tell the truth. And now that it was over, legally, publicly, definitively, I felt disoriented. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the settlement documents again, rereading the words, the signatures, the terms. It was all there, $250,000.00 in damages, a signed admission of ethical violation by Madison, Jessica's withdrawal from all executive consulting contracts for the next 2 years, and a formal notice of license revocation filed with the Board of Behavioral Sciences. I should have felt victorious, and maybe, in some buried part of me, I did, but mostly I felt emptied out. What no one tells you about revenge, about justice, is that it doesn't come with a standing ovation. There's no crowd cheering when the villain gets exposed, no music swelling when you take back your power. There's just you, standing in the aftermath, looking around at what's left. And sometimes, what's left is a scarred version of your life you no longer recognize. I couldn't go back to my old job. Not that I would have wanted to. My career had been publicly derailed. My reputation, while no longer tarnished by implication, still carried the weight of the ordeal. People admired what I did, yes, but they also looked at me like I was radioactive, like I had survived something they never wanted to touch. So I began rebuilding, quietly, intentionally. I used part of the settlement to take 6 months off, no work, no clients, no meetings. I enrolled in a trauma-informed leadership course, not because I wanted to become a coach or a therapist, but because I needed to understand what had happened to me from the inside out. I wanted language for the way trust collapses when power is abused. I wanted to trace the anatomy of manipulation, not just so I could heal, but so I could see it coming next time, anywhere, in anyone. I started writing again, not press releases or strategy memos, but essays, personal ones. Raw and uncomfortable and defiant. I published them under my own name. I stopped hiding, and to my surprise, people read them. They shared them, they reached out. One of those messages came from a woman named Danielle, an executive coach who specialized in workplace trauma. She had seen my name in the settlement filing, then read my essays. She invited me to speak at a private conference for mental health professionals and executive leaders, off the record, she promised. No press, no cameras. I almost said no. I wasn't ready to be the woman people paraded out to talk about betrayal. But something in her email struck me. We need voices that know the language of survival and the structure of power. You know both. So I agreed. The event was held in a quiet retreat center just outside Napa. Clean air, warm wood tones, the kind of place where people wear linen and talk slowly. I walked in expecting to be stared at like a cautionary tale, but instead, I was met with an almost reverent kind of attention. People weren't just curious, they were listening. Really listening. I told them everything. Not just the clean legal version from the court filings, but the messy middle. The part where I doubted myself. The part where I woke up at 3 a.m. panicking that maybe I was overreacting. The part where I recorded therapy sessions while feeling like a criminal just to protect myself from the actual criminals in front of me. I told them how Jessica had weaponized empathy, how Madison had cloaked exploitation in soft words and neutral tones, and how I'd had to become colder than both of them just to survive. When I finished, the room was silent, and then, slowly, people started to speak. A therapist in her 50s confessed that she'd once overshared a client's story at a dinner party and hadn't realized the damage until years later. A CEO admitted that he'd hired consultants who had used personal data to shape hiring and firing decisions without employee knowledge. A woman in HR broke down crying, saying she'd been complicit in silencing an employee who had accused an executive of psychological abuse. It wasn't redemption, but it was something close. Not for them, for me. It was the first time I'd stood in a room and watched people sit with the discomfort of my story without trying to fix it, justify it, or escape it. After that, the invitations started coming. Podcasts, panels, think tanks. I declined most of them. I wasn't interested in becoming a mascot for professional ethics. But I agreed to do one more interview with a national magazine that wanted to write a feature on power, therapy, and the new ethics of leadership. The journalist was sharp, respectful, and thorough. She asked real questions. She didn't sensationalize. When the piece was published, the headline read, "When Therapy Turns into Strategy, the Executive Who Fought Back." It was cleaner than I would have written it, but the story underneath was honest. In the final paragraph, she asked me what I had learned. I told her the truth, that safety isn't found in silence, that boundaries are only as strong as your willingness to enforce them, that when people cross lines quietly, they expect you to respond quietly too, and that if you scream loud enough, strategically, methodically, and without apology, they'll either learn something or disappear, sometimes both. Madison's name no longer appeared in the state registry of licensed therapists. Jessica had rebranded, predictably, launching a vague leadership advisory practice under a different name, but no one was buying. Her LinkedIn was a graveyard of dropped endorsements. The industry had moved on, quietly but decisively, and I had too. I took the last portion of the settlement money and invested it into a nonprofit that offered legal and psychological support for professionals navigating workplace retaliation and abuse. I didn't put my name on it. I didn't want recognition. I just wanted to build something I would have needed a year ago. Something that might make it easier for the next woman who sat in a therapist's office and wondered if her pain was truly hers or if it was just another asset waiting to be monetized by someone else. One afternoon, months later, I received a small envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, "You don't know me, but what you did changed the way I practice. I'm a better therapist now. Thank you." I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Not because I needed a reminder of the past, but because I had built a future that no longer needed protecting. I wasn't someone who got used. I wasn't someone who broke quietly. I was someone who outlived the people who underestimated me. And in the silence they left behind, I had built something stronger than revenge. I had built peace. With teeth. 16 months after it all began, I stood at the edge of a stage in a small auditorium in Seattle, holding a microphone in my right hand and watching the audience settle into a quiet, expectant stillness. The event was small, by design, an off-the-record gathering of professionals from tech, healthcare, and law, all gathered under the banner of integrity in confidential spaces. I hadn't planned to speak again after the last panel. I had told my story enough times to enough people, but when the organizer asked me to close the weekend, I said yes, not because I had anything new to add, but because I wanted to say something I had never said before, not to an audience, not even to myself. And as I looked out into that room, filled with people who had spent the weekend dissecting systems of failure and manipulation, I realized this was the moment. I told them I used to believe that silence was strength, that discretion was dignity, that rising above betrayal meant never looking back at it. I told them how I had learned, painfully and publicly, that there is nothing dignified about letting predators keep their masks, that discretion only protects the powerful when it becomes a shield for abuse. And I told them, without anger or vengeance in my voice, that I had survived a kind of betrayal most people don't see coming, because it wears a kind face and speaks in soft tones. It shakes your hand, it smiles at your vulnerability, and then it sells it. But I also told them this: I am not a cautionary tale. I am not just a survivor. I am proof that when you refuse to play dead, when you fight with facts and precision, and when you stay standing long enough, the people who built their lives on your silence eventually run out of ground. Afterward, someone asked me if I would ever go back to corporate leadership. I smiled. No, I said, not because I'm afraid, but because I'm finally building something that can't be taken from me. And that was the truth. I had started my own consultancy, not flashy, not viral, not built on trauma, but rooted in protecting people before the damage happens. I work with companies now to build structures that don't just respond to abuse, but prevent it. Real systems, real accountability, and I do it quietly, intentionally, without branding myself as a whistleblower or victim, because I'm not. I'm someone who saw a machine working exactly as it was designed and decided to jam the gears until it collapsed. Jessica's name never resurfaced in any real way. Her firm never recovered. Madison moved out of state, according to a former client who emailed me months ago. She's no longer practicing. No license, no patience, no pretense. The silence around them now is deafening, and I've stopped waiting for the apology that will never come, because I don't need it. I don't need their regret to validate what I already know. I was right. I was careful, and I was relentless. Not because revenge consumed me, but because I understood something they never did. Some of us are not built to forget. We are built to remember, and to make sure others remember too. One night, long after the lawsuit had settled and the headlines faded, I sat alone in my apartment with a copy of the podcast that had launched the public side of it all. I hadn't listened to it since it aired, but I played it then, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. My voice came through the speakers, calm, composed, measured. I was telling my story like it belonged to someone else, and in a way it did, because I'm not the same woman anymore. The woman in that recording was still bleeding, still fighting for space, still hoping the world would take her side. But the woman listening now, she didn't need validation. She'd already won. I shut the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and closed my eyes, not to escape, but to finally rest. There were no more steps, no more emails, no more strategies, just stillness. And in that stillness, the echo of a promise I had once made to myself. I paid $1,200, 0 cents a month to be broken open. Then I made them pay everything for trying to bury me in what they found. And now I was free.